oh, Tanya, I didn't give you one. You've actually seen this already because this article was sent as part of an addendum to the file. But this is the project that I'd like to talk about today. And so, influence of siblings on out-of-school reading practices. It is part of a larger research project, which really looks at out of first-generation college graduates with advanced degrees. This particular aspect of the study is just focused on 26 out of the original 40 individuals who my research collaborator and myself had identified as first-generation college graduates with advanced degrees. So what that means is people whose parents did not attend college or university, but they themselves did attend college or university, and they achieved at least one more degree beyond that. So it could have been a master's, or it could have been a doctorate of some kind. And what we were looking for was, well, my co-collaborator is not in education, she's in sociology. And so her name is Professor Mary Platoon, and she is really focused on family sociology. And so she was kind of interested, she herself is a first generation college graduate with advanced degrees, and both my parents are first generation college graduates with advanced degrees. And this is kind of a unique subset of people because, as I'm sure you're aware, it's much more likely that people will achieve an advanced degree if their parents had some higher education background. And so this was kind of a unique group of people who in some ways defied the odds. And we specifically wanted to, so she wanted to look at family combinations as a sociologist, and I was much more interested in the literacy aspect. So how is it that research has shown that literacy development is really important for academic longevity. So if that's true, and we can assume that it was true, we're going to check that with our individuals. But we were also going to then ask them and inquire into, well, how are those literacy habits and skills developed over time, right? So this particular one, this study explores issues related to first-generation longevity, specifically looking at 26 first-generation university graduates with advanced degrees who also have at least one older sibling. So we chose to narrow that focus to these two important subtypes, the independent reading development of these individuals and the possible influence of older siblings on these practices. So this is a subset of a larger study, like I said, of the 40 participants. And those 40 participants, we discovered named particular literacy sponsors or people who were particularly influential in their literacy development. The majority of them listed parents as literacy sponsors. And that kind of goes against the literature, first and foremost, because there is an assumption among some people and among common sense that people whose parents didn't go to college or people from working class families in general don't, quote unquote, value literacy or value education. But this research certainly contradicted that. That in fact, the large majority, 65% of those 40 participants, their parents were the #1 sponsors of literacy. But then we theorized that the 35%, the 35% of the participants whose parents were not the #1 literacy sponsors, are they perhaps the most vulnerable? In other words, are they perhaps the ones who teachers should be most concerned about, right? Because if we're interested in interrupting the reproduction of social inequalities, and we want more people to defy the odds. We want more people to go to college whose parents didn't go to college. We want more people to get advanced degrees whose parents didn't get advanced degrees. If the parents were not the main literacy sponsors, who were they, right? Who were these people who helped these people who ended up getting advanced degrees develop their literacy habits, right? So in our largest study, we were able to see a number of different sponsors other than parents. So They were siblings, they were aunts and uncles, they were grandparents, they were librarians, they were teachers, they were church members, and there were institutions like churches and schools and friendly neighbors, really friendly, caring neighbors, right? So all of those different people had been identified as people who either read with our participants as children, or gave them books, or recommended books, or talked to them about books, or other kinds of literature, these kinds of things. So we thought that that was really interesting, and that was a separate study. But we really thought that there were 26 particular participants who listed older siblings as literacy sponsors. We thought, you know what, I think that's an under-theorized, under-researched area, the influence of siblings on literacy development. There has been some literature on it. Eve Gregory, for example, who's a British scholar, has done some work on it. De Volk, I can't remember what her first name is, but De Volk has done some literature on sibling. And there have been a number of different ethnographies, and people like Shirley Bryce Heath and Purcell Gates, and some of the other kind of new literacy ethnographers have all talked about siblings, but certainly not about people with advanced degrees who are first generation, right? So we thought that that was kind of an interesting area to research. Because, well, I'll get to because. Okay, so why did we focus on that? Because independent recreational reading has been found to have a moderate to strong connection to long-term education success, as defined by academic longevity. And the development of these reading habits remain poorly understood, and because the research on the influence of siblings is also scarce. What's much more typical in literacy, as all of you know, in literacy research of the family nature, is ethnographies that just kind of observe how children interact with books and literacy, other literature and games and non-formal, just day-to-day literacy, right? But a lot of that research will assume that if people are working class or poor, that the literacy that they use will not necessarily translate into academic success, right? So a lot of the literacy that Shirley Bryce Heath and Purcell Gates and Nat LaRue and other people look at, they assume that the class divisions mean that even though there's lots of literacy in people's lives, as even though they're poor or working class, their parents didn't go to college, that probably won't lead to a college degree. And this is a unique study, because what we did with this was we looked backwards. We looked at people who already had achieved an advanced degree, and looking back and, well, how did that develop, right? Because you can over-determine the idea that somebody with from working class will not go to college because of that class difference. Okay. So what do we already know about this topic? Independent recreational reading habits can affect academic longevity. That almost 78% of U.S. children have at least one sibling. So we know that there are several siblings are prevalent. Okay, how much are we looking at siblings as influential for academic development? Research on influence of siblings is scarce. The existing studies suggest that siblings do actually greatly affect literacy development of one another, and that reading is often misunderstood as a solitary practice. We typically kind of think of, before the new literacy studies, we kind of thought of literacy as something that, or reading as something that you did alone, quietly, in your room at night, or under a tree, and who knows. But actually there are lots of social interactions that go along with reading, which really affects, but it affects identity development and motivation to do it. Okay, so what we tried to do with our interview participants is that we asked them about their practices and their use and reading practices of their older siblings. So we asked them specifically about their own development, as well as ask them about, well, what do you know about your older siblings? What kind of books do they read? Do they recommend anything to you? Did you inherit any books or literature from your older siblings? They reported that they formed strong habits of at-home reading in their youth. 96% of our participants reported that their older siblings played some kind of role. The ones that did not said that their siblings were much older than them. And so there was like kind of this gap where they just really didn't feel like they were influenced very much. And then we also drew on Jim G's theory of discourses that suggests that family interactions around reading may not only have improved participants' reading abilities, but may have also encouraged participants to form dispositions and identities that included viewing themselves as readers, and that their siblings had something to do with that identity. Okay, so these are some of the questions that we asked everybody. Talk about yourself in reading. When did you first become interested in reading? Who were models of reading for you? Did your older siblings read? What were their interests? Where did you find reading materials when you were young? Did anyone in your family discourage reading or give you negative messages about reading habits in particular? Of course, it was a semi-structured interview, so we would ask, these were kind of like the written down questions that we had in front of us, but anything that somebody said, we would always kind of follow up and say, oh, tell me more about this particular author or this particular genre or this particular practice that you had, or tell me more about your siblings and how many siblings, and now you told me about this sibling, or what about that sibling, or what about that sibling. So these are just kind of the baseline, but then we can follow up on that. Okay, so these are our overarching sort of quantitative findings, which were that 65% reported having at least one older sibling. Oh, this is of the larger study of the 40. Okay, so 25 out of 26 reported that an older sibling either modeled reading for them, or I guess just modeled reading for them, and the participant was able to identify out-of-school reading interests of their older sibling, so they knew what their older sibling liked to read. 20 out of 26, or 77%, said that although they may have been more avid reader than their older sibling had some kind of influence, and that could have been modeling, so the younger sibling saw their older sibling reading, or sharing reading material, talking about reading material, reading out aloud to them, directly teaching how to read to their younger siblings, or commenting in general about their reading abilities, like you should read, or you're a really great reader. 17 out of the 26 said that their older sibling did share. So this is breaking down this number. So 17 out of 26 reported that their older sibling shared reading materials. 10 reported their older sibling talked to them about particular books. 3 out of 26, or 12%, reported that their older sibling read aloud to them. 3 out of 26 said that their older sibling actually taught them how to read. So, of course, I'm sure you're thinking about, well, there are limitations to this methodology, right? How could this methodology possibly accurately describe the relationships that happen sometimes 10, 30, 40 years ago for some of these participants? The article has a breakout, and the article actually describes everything that I'm saying in much more detail. But the article does have a breakout of list of all the pseudonyms that we gave to the participants, as well as some characteristics of them, like the decade in which they were born, and their gender, and other things. But and I should just say up front, one of the limitations of this methodology is that when we interview people about their childhood and about their relationships and about their reading, what are those stories? How do you know they're accurate? And is it possible that they misremember? Is it possible that they can't remember all the details of, how many interactions they had about literacy with their siblings? Is it just, are they cultural stories that people tell, But we theorize that since this really is about motivation to read, that it's okay. Well, for one thing, you can't do an actual ethnography. People have tried, but it's really hard to do an ethnography of people over 30, 40 years, right? Shirley Bryce Heath has done that, and some other people have done that, And that's really valuable scholarship. But this is kind of like the next best thing for this kind of research, which is we just ask people what they understand about their own development and understanding relationships, right? So we know that there are limitations, but it's still interesting. And the stories that people tell is the meaning that they made out of it. And the meaning that they made out of it is probably more influential to their motivation than an accurate retelling of every tiny thing that actually happened, right? Because our identities and our motivations are our own understanding, based on our own understanding. Okay, so these are breaking down some of the different ways that these literacy and relationships worked. So shared reading material. So this is an example of one of the people. Okay, so this is going back to shared reading. So this is an example from one of these 65% who reported that they're older. So I'm basically going to provide examples or quotes from representative people from each of these different categories. So Amy responded, mostly I would say we younger ones got more diversified books than they did, because we got to read authors that came up and we got to read the older books that they had already read. So we kind of got some new ones, but we also got the old ones that they had. So you can see how a younger sibling could benefit from having an expanded library than what their older sibling had. Of course, it assumes that the younger sibling got new books, right? It might not be a better library if they just all had hand-me-downs and didn't have the new literature, right? But you can see that this is one way that a younger sibling could benefit. Okay, modeling reading. So in response to the question, did you pay attention to what your older siblings were reading? One person said, my oldest brother read a lot of sports stuff. He read Sport magazine. It was just called Sport. It wasn't Sports Illustrated. My second oldest brother read a lot of cowboy stuff. He loved Zane Grey, and I read all of his cowboy books too that he had. And I can't think of all the authors, but he was really into the Wild West. Right? So this is somebody who currently, I think he's in his upper 60s. He was in his upper 60s when I interviewed him. And, so this is a while back for him, but he could remember what his older siblings were reading, what kind of literature, what kind of magazines, and these kind of things. So that suggests that he was influenced by his older sibling. Talking about literature. So 10 other participants reported that they remember talking about literature with their older sibling. As I look back on it, one of my brothers was heavily influential in reading during my teenage years because he bought books, brought books home, talked to me about books, and really inspired me to read them. He was very influential in actually passing the books on to me, and he's quite the storyteller, so he got me excited about reading that way. And my older brother's invested in publications, like Sports Illustrated, was one of the magazines that they subscribed to. I don't think this is really a representative example. I think this is one of the examples that really kind of showed more influence from the older sibling. But you can really see, his language, that older sibling talked to him. And, if you have an older sibling that subscribes to a magazine and it's like hot off the press and it's about a topic that you like, that's a real gift to the younger sibling. That they could talk about it, that they could share it, that they might be able to learn more about it and expand their vocabulary and all the skills that go with literacy. Okay, so recommending reading sources. So 7 participants reported that their older siblings recommended reading material. So George said he would share the enjoyment of particular stories. My oldest brothers and I shared whether or not we enjoyed something. Okay, so kind of short or not elaborated maybe. And then somebody said, I would talk to one older sibling about books. He would point me to these books, and so I would say that older brother either liked the book or didn't like it, or I didn't like it. But I felt that the gap between me and the 2 oldest siblings was just too large. We didn't really have that kind of relationship where we would talk books or whatever. Sometimes the more siblings that you have, the better in some ways. Well, for this particular person, you can see how older siblings could help. Okay, I love this story, so I want to share it with you. And forgive me for reading off of the slide. But so this is a participant who had lots of siblings. lots of older siblings. And so she said, so the people who read aloud mostly were the older ones because the books were scarce. So my brother, who was fluent in reading, read it aloud for us. So in the evenings, like when we were waiting for the dinner, or when we went to our grandmother's house in the rural area, and we needed a flashlight, he's the one who used to read the book. But he didn't read it orally like the way you take a book and just read it. He used to read the book and tell us the story. So he used to say, wait, let me read the next 5 pages. He's a fast reader, by the way. So then he could tell us, okay, this is what James Bond is doing now. Then he left, then he did this, then he did that. And then we were all waiting. Are you fascinated? So she's asking me as the interviewer, are you fascinated? You know, because she clearly was fascinated. And like her story about it was, you know, and then later in that same interview, she said, I miss those days. You know, so to really think about what that must have been like, you know, to having an older sibling telling you a story, you know, and what messages are you receiving to have an older sort of like respected elder, you know, sibling be so fascinated with something that they want you to know the story about James Bond. And it's not, you know, what they did, it's what James Bond did, you know, and so it's about literacy, it's about the literature, but it's really about the relationships, right? It's about, you know, and then to reflect on it, to say, I miss those days. To me, says that it was, you know, it was a really special moment that she carries with her. She also said later in the interview that they still, when they talk to each other on the phone, that the arguments just start right up again. You know, and they still kind of like recommend books, and they share books, and then they argue about them, and you know, but it's just it's about the relationships that kind of revolves around religion and literacy. Okay, so then there are siblings as teachers. So another participant, Joe, reported that an older sibling chastised him for not being able to read better, and that he should spend more time reading. So he says, my older brother reprimanded me because of my poor reading skills every day. I don't know if that was an exaggeration or not, but I mean, he encouraged me to read, but I think my interest in reading when I started to read on my own was really influenced by him. This one assertion to me was when I was about 9, and I remember running home from school, and I said, so-and-so, I have a girlfriend. And he said, girlfriends are for your bigger brothers and sisters. You need to be focused on your books. You need to be conscious of your studying.
Sounds like some parroting of Papa.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So who knows where that was coming from? But you know, to think about, okay, well, that's the message he's getting from his siblings. But I mean, doesn't that also contradict the typical association or the typical assumption that we have, which is that only adults teach, right? And that siblings are either bad influences, or they just play, or they just they get in trouble, or they distract you. Whereas only parents and teachers are the ones who should be involved in literacy, right? So this kind of contradicts that.
I'm overwhelmed by all the boys who are talking about this influence with their siblings. So it's boys. I mean, we've only seen one girl, and she's influenced by her brother.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a breakdown between the 40?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, there were only 10 female or 10 males. Wait, that's continued. Sorry. 1, 2, 3. So no, it's actually 50-50.
It was 50-50 because the samples are all boys being influenced by boys except for one.
You know, we didn't count that. I don't think we counted the gender of the older siblings. We only counted the gender of the participants.
And that's one of my questions now is that if boys are said to be non-readers in comparison to girls, I wonder what that says about the findings here. With all the boys being influenced by boys except for the one.
Yeah. I would be careful to make a gender claim on such a small sample. I mean, it's certainly a question. It raises a question of like, let's do a
Right, but
larger
it's
study.
something you didn't look at.
No, let's do a larger study because there certainly are quotes where there are older girls that were teaching. Like, I don't think I have. No, I certainly have another quote. I think the quote is actually in the article, and it's of an older sister who was really a teacher.
Because reading is a feminized pastime.
True. Yeah, so on page 9, halfway down, it says, this is Judy, and she says, well, my older sister read to us, and she kind of filled the place of the teacher in doing the novel. My mother would get very tired, so the summer thing, when we weren't going to school, was every afternoon, my older sister would pack a lunch for myself and the 3 little ones. The 4 of us, we lived on a farm, so we would walk out to the gravel pit and swim for a while, and then we'd eat, and then she'd read to us. We had a grove, like, of trees. And she did that for my mother. So that's one example. But let's see. And there were certainly other examples where girls were talking about. Yeah.
So the so in a larger study of the 40, that was 50-50. You had 50. You interviewed 50 women and 50 men.
No, we 40.
I mean 20. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember.
Do that.
This was certainly 13-13.
I have no problem.
It was almost 50-50 in a way.
Okay.
Yeah. But here's another example on page 8 where Sarah said, I remember my older sister coming home from college and trying to get me to read. I think for a birthday when I was a younger teenager, maybe even 11, 12, she bought me a subscription to like highlights for one of those. I remember having to choose books to buy, and I wasn't really that thrilled about it. I wanted the new Michael Jordan high tops, because I was just so much into sports.
It's,
Yeah.
it was just a question
Yeah,
that I had
yeah.
based on the selection of
Yeah.
examples you've shared.
Yeah, and then Amy also said, of course, we didn't have enough money. Not even my neighbors had enough money to buy all the books we would have wanted, so I wanted to switch with the neighbors at the same age, and my brothers and sisters who are older. So they passed down books to me that they had already read. So anyway, and we started out the article talking about the book, The Colored Water. I'm not sure if you're familiar
That's a
with
great
that
book.
Yeah. It was a national bestseller, and it was a memoir by an author named James McBride. And it was mostly a story about his mother, who was a white Jewish woman, and she had 12 children that were all children of color. And the mother had never gone to college, and all 12 of her children went to college, and many of them got advanced degrees. And so we thought that was a really interesting memoir, but it wasn't a research study. It was, a best-selling book. But the way that James McBride had described it was that his mother was just so amazing, right? And she was just tenacious, and she would take the kids out to the museum every weekend, or to the library, or bring home books from the library, or just really valued education for her 12 children, right? And so we start the piece by saying, well, yes, okay, but that begs the question of how did, because there were bits and pieces of that book where it talked about how the older siblings took care of the younger siblings, right? But that's not the telling of the story of the memoir. It was all about the mother and how tenacious she was, and how anti-racist she was, and how focused on education she was, right? So this kind of like came out of like, what about the siblings? And what is the influence of the older siblings, both in that story, but also more generally, because we so often think about the adults as being the teachers, right? Okay, so then we theorized about identity and about what it is that causes people to either resist or to be gravitated towards academic identities or reading identities. And I think G's theory of discourses is powerful, and it's identity is a controversial concept, and so I think it's important to identify a particular concept. And so if you're not familiar, G's theory of discourses is basically that what a discourse is it's more than language, but it's partly language, it's partly your vocabulary and what kind of words you use and your language. But it also is more than that. It's where you're comfortable, it's what kind of food you eat, how you dress, how you walk, where you're likely, it's your culture essentially. And then he has this idea of primary discourses, which are it's an identity kit. He says the identity kit that you kind of unconsciously acquire from your first family, from your first culture, what people like us do, he says. And then secondary discourses, he differentiates between your home culture, your primary discourse, and secondary discourses are public. It's how you're expected, or what you are expected, or how you do behave, and your identity outside in public spaces and different public spaces. So he talks about churches and gangs and work environments and school environments and other people's houses, grandparents, and these kind of things. But it's mostly public, of things that your family won't be there. And he argues that acquisition is basically unconscious. And so your primary discourse mostly happens to you by acquisition. It's not something that you're consciously thinking of, this is what I'm going to eat, this is what I like to eat, this is what people like us eat. It's just what happens to you. But your secondary discourses could be from acquisition or learning. And learning is more conscious, it's more taught, it's more top down, it's more rote, it's more, people have to, it's more difficult, right? And so what he argues is that if your primary discourse is very different from the secondary discourse that you're trying to inhabit, it's very different, it will require more learning. Whereas if it's the same, then it'll just be kind of unconscious. So for example, if you were born into a family and your parents are both teachers and you go to school, it's gonna feel a lot like home. Because, yes, exactly. Because in the way that I speak with my children, it's a lot like how I used to speak to my 4th and 5th grade students, right? It's like, okay, you have 2 more minutes to do that. Okay, now you have 1 more minute to do it. Okay, now it's time for you to clean up. Listen, I gave you a warning. Or like, how did things go today? Oh, well, tell me about what you did in art, and tell me about what you did at recess. Who did you play with at recess? And tell me a story. Like the story kind of has like a particular genre structure, and it's like, first I did this, then I did that, then I did that. And different people from different cultural traditions tell stories differently, and they have different characters and different morals. They might have a moral of the story. And G does a really great job of kind of comparing and contrasting those. So why does that matter? Is that, okay, so this is our main argument, which is that independent or recreational reading is a unique practice. It's a powerful practice because it can provide a bridge between an individual's primary or home discourse and their school-based secondary discourse. While individuals are reading, they are encountering vocabulary words, there are descriptions of experiences, values, and ideologies that are often valued in schools, but may not be encountered at home. Yet, since recreational reading often takes place at home, within the comfort of one's primary discourse, surrounded by and possibly involving family members, such as siblings, these new vocabulary words and descriptions may be acquired in a much more comfortable, less stressful, less intimidating, more welcoming way than learned, requiring much less effort. Further, individuals who are part of a family that regularly reads together or in close proximity may be less likely to resist the kind of learning of a secondary discourse valued in schools. In short, recreational reading may allow individuals to more easily develop a discourse value in schools, especially students whose primary discourses might be very different than the secondary discourses value. So we're talking about people whose parents are not teachers. So if your parents are not teachers, your primary discourse is more likely to be, and especially if you're from a poor working class background, your primary discourse is likely to be more difficult, more different, and require more learning and acquisition of the secondary discourses valued in school. And that's essentially what inequality in schools is all about, and why we have to understand that, you know, the discourses and the language and the culture of schools are white middle class culture. And how do students either are they welcomed into it? Are they not welcomed into it? Why are they resistant to it? They might be resistant because it's harder, and because they might gain social influence by resisting with fellow travelers who also feel that school rejects them. Right? So recreational reading is a way that might mean that students are less likely to feel rejected by school. So why does that matter, and why should we care? Okay, so a lack of attention to sibling relationships and the potential influence on literacy. Okay, so I should back up and I should say, so sibling influence is important because you can see an older sibling as being part of the primary discourse, and you can, you know, acquire knowledge from them, and it makes it less likely for you to say that people like us don't do that, because your older sibling is actually modeling, you know, school type activities for you, right? So as a result of lack of attention to sibling and the potential influence on literacy development, educators and parents may be missing opportunities to educate young people by neglecting to offer guidance and resources to older siblings, for example, who could use reading resources both for their own literacy development as well as that for their siblings. So if you're a teacher or a principal at a school and you're really interested in increasing the literacy development of your students, why should we focus just on the students that are in your class? Why not see younger siblings of your students as being almost like secondary, you know, students that you might be able to influence their literacy development through the literacy development of your own immediate students, right? Since recreational reading involves mobilizing identities and this highly social process, educators can and should create opportunities for students with siblings to choose from a wide range of reading materials. Students should be encouraged to talk with friends, siblings, and others about what they read in a variety of settings, both at school and at home. So there is an example in the article, actually I read it out loud to you, and it was of a younger sibling whose older sibling was encouraging her to read, and also for a birthday gift, she was given, you know, like a book or like a highlights magazine, and she did not like that. So a younger sibling could easily resist the activities of an older sibling, right? So it's probably not wise to tell students to say, you must go home and teach your younger siblings, right? That would be too heavy-handed. That probably would backfire, right? So what are maybe more gentle ways that you can encourage the real, you know, influence of older siblings on their literacy, or vice versa, in their literacy development? You know, another thing that we talk about in the paper is book buddies. You know, so I think during the interview, actually, earlier today, I was talking about how I had a book buddy relationship in my 4th and 5th grade class with the kindergarten and 1st grade class across the hall, and that every Friday they would read together, right? And so it was easy for some students, more easy than other students, and it might be because they were used to reading aloud to their siblings. But whether it's, you know, something that they do at home or not, it probably is good practice for especially older children to practice reading with younger children for lots of reasons. Because it's a good role model for the younger children, but it also could be something that builds confidence with the older kids and builds confidence with younger kids, especially if younger kids can read aloud to the older kids. But those are some of the things that teachers might be able to do, maybe principals, maybe school-wide effort might be to encourage older students to read aloud to younger students, and to maybe send reading material home with kids if they have younger. Maybe if you're a 4th and 5th grade teacher, for example, or older, or another grade, ask your students, do you have a younger sibling? Oh, really? Tell them about your younger sibling. You know, what kind of books do they like? What kind of literature do they like? Have you ever read aloud to them? You know, maybe send home some literature that your students' younger siblings might like. Right? Thinking about younger siblings as secondary students could take advantage of these relationships and how powerful that influence could be on the literacy development of young children. That's where I'm going to leave it. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question. Yeah. I'm really interested in this idea of siblings, but also too about how sibling interactions are changing quite a bit in the home setting, especially with more and more devices coming into the home and each child having their own device. And so they're interacting with siblings still. And so that's why it'd be really interesting to like reproduce the study and look at siblings now maybe, or I guess we have to wait a little bit, but I mean, but just that idea, and I think they're bringing in a lot of that near-peer network analysis of like, how are literacy sponsors and understanding of literacy sponsors, are they changing now that literacy sponsor may not be in the home anymore, but or maybe it started outside and then comes in. So like analyzing that circulation of text.
Right.
So maybe the highlights book. Wah, 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 wah. Sorry, Aunt Marge.
Yeah.
But yet all of a sudden, this graphic novel, the whole like Amulet graphic novel series came from a friend online, and then came into the home, and then the older brother all of a sudden could recommend it, and then that identity development. I just think there's a really lot of interesting stuff going on with that network near peer network analysis and looking at siblings, but that is just one node within the network
Oh, definitely.
of learning.
Yeah. And how do you even define what a sibling is?
Yeah.
Right? Because people have all kinds of sort of half siblings and, near sort of friends that are like siblings and they're treated like siblings, all kinds of family structures.
Yeah. And I was very drawn to the boy examples that you had. And maybe I'm taking this too far, but I think that a lot of times you're right, boys get this bad rap in school that boys aren't readers. And how might there be, there's the whole guys read movement within public libraries.
Yeah.
How might these near peer older siblings, boy partner pair buddies, how might that be a space of like where teaching actually can be received in a way that's not threatening to the social identity, in a way that maybe the older sister is like, I don't want to do that, but all of a sudden the older brother who's like, hey, do this or read more. I know there's really some interesting gender dynamics there that can that.
Yeah. It's partly why
as you can see,
yeah. It's partly why I think choice of literacy materials is so important, because this is something that we really talked about more in the other paper, which is the cultivation of relationships is not just top down. In fact, it's maybe only 50% top down. Like the other side of it has to be, they have agency. Younger siblings have agency. It's like, are they going to embrace it, or are they going to reject it, or are they, relationships are complex, right? And that's what we're talking about.
But I was wondering though about the generation that you interviewed, because there's this presumption that working class people are not readers.
Right.
But my parents' generation, well, of course they were readers. There was no TV. So if you're interviewing folks who are in their 60s a few years ago, what you probably gathered your data in 2013, 2014, if those folks were in their 60s who are now pushing maybe 70, that more than likely, why wouldn't their parents think of themselves as readers? Because they came from that generation that didn't go to college, but still graduated high school, and reading was of value because it was that ingredient. So now it would be really interesting to interview a younger group, because maybe that percentage of being influenced by their parents would be different, because perhaps now they're not readers, but they're TV watchers.
Yeah.
So that might
Right.
change also.
Yeah, and similar to that, I think this needs a lot more theorization and a lot more research, which is what's happening with the social media, the relationship-driven literacy that happens with texting, Facebook, you know, all of the social media that people use. I mean, it is literacy. But the question is, does it translate into academic literacy where, you know, your vocabulary is continuously expanding, where it's going to actually help you in a high school English class, you know?
And there's some research that's being done that reading literary texts does support academic literacy,
Right.
but these technology literacies do not support academic
Yeah.
literacy.
I think more research has to be done about that because I think it's probably variable. And that probably if you and I text, we probably use language, or like when you're texting like with your niece in Brooklyn, are you going to use words that she's never heard before?
Right.
That probably would happen.
Right, and if we look at how technology has changed over the years, I mean, originally, if you emailed somebody, that was informal communication. Now, if you're not using formal academic English in your email, you're considered an idiot. And then text messaging, right? Text messaging originally was again all abbreviations, 8, great,
Right.
things like that. And now people are being chastised for not writing out the words, and so then we move to Twitter. And
Yeah, right.
and right and
Yeah.
and in 140 characters. I mean, look at our president. Everything he can't do anything in 140 characters.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
going on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Which I think calls into question what is academic literacy.
And is it ever stagnant? Because
Right, or informal literacy, which
I mean,
keeps
if
getting
like
taken over.
missiles can be fired because of a tweet, that tells me that that's a formal language.
And so is it possible that the younger generation, the millennials, are kind of all increasing their literacy consumption in a sense, but they're all doing it simultaneously, so it's not really gonna, is it going to differentially affect people in that generation? Right. I think with the books that we're talking about with these particular participants, Donna, I take your point that there was only the radio and books in some ways.
In some ways,
But some people didn't read the books.
that would be true. But also, some cultures value education over other cultures. So that could have influenced why there was reading in the house, whether or not the parents finished high school or graduated high school. Because culturally, what was the attitude about education, no matter who you are. I mean, my grandparents, they didn't get, my grandfather never went to school except to yeshiva when he was in Europe. And my grandmother only went through the 8th grade, but they were readers.
Yeah, I think there's a huge shifting of what it means to be a reader and what it means to be literate. I mean, you brought up, you have in here the Brandt work on literacy scholars.
Yeah,
And I think her most recent book, Age of Mass Literacy, is like really trying to take that idea of the literacy scholar and saying that there is this mass consumption, but also I would argue mass production that's really exploding our understanding of literacy. And so, what does that mean then for how these social pockets or these social discourse communities inform which we learn? Literacy, it's exciting. It's exciting. Well, it's exciting to be part of that. But it's incredibly daunting to be in teacher education and where academic literacy in a more perhaps outdated form.
I was going to say narrow.
Is very much the high stakes way of performing, which brings back that whole question of inequities again, in terms of like the kids, if they're walking into the classroom, are ready with that because they have the 2 teacher parents, or
know,
Yeah, it's,
what are the gateways that they had to go through?
Mhm.
And also different people have different definitions of success, right? So we were kind of assuming that if you have an advanced degree that you are somehow successful. But that might not be the case for other people's value system, you know. Why should we say that these are necessarily the more successful people of, you know, of that generation or people who are first generation college graduates, you know.
And it makes you wonder what their disciplines were. I mean, some people don't think
Right.
of themselves as readers, even
Right.
if they have advanced
Right,
degrees.
right, yeah, and I think it says that in this article, I mean, it says what, I mean, it's a particular sample, and many of these particular people were academics. You know, not all of them. Many of them also were teachers. So it's kind of a bias sample. So I think a lot more research needs to be done about this, and it should guide, but I think if there's a finding that's important, it's that we can use family literacy to encourage both you know, socializing around literacy as well as expanding the vocabulary and the academic reading ability of children.
And I think a lot of the family literacy projects are have this undergirding assumption that the families are not literate. And
Exactly.
they don't read.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's there doesn't seem to be a lot of projects that are using family literacy assets,
Right.
and to
Yeah.
extend those.
Yeah.
In the literature.
You know, another thing that we thought was kind of interesting is that of the group of 40, where we asked people who their, you know, most prominent literacy sponsor was, only 9 of them listed a teacher. And we thought that that was kind of interesting. Why only 9? Is it because they thought, oh, well, I will need it. Of course teachers are literacy. That's what they're paid to do, right? That's their job. Of course I went through the school system, and of course they taught me how to read. But the people who specifically listed a teacher as being a major influence on literacy development, they were not normal relationships with a teacher and a student. They were like above and beyond. They were, you know, teachers who, you know, either lived next door, and they were also family friends, and they had a library in their basement, and, you know, that was one of the examples. And a participant went over to her neighbor's house, who was their former teacher, and that teacher would let them take out a book, or would encourage them to take out a book.
do you know offhand how many of those 9 are women? Or, well, girls, I guess, the time, but then women when you interview them. That would be really, not, I mean, I don't mean.
I think all of them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
well, if we
Why do you
think of
think that might be?
schools are much more friendly to girls.
Yes. Oh, you mean the participants themselves?
That identified
Yeah.
a teacher as the.
I can think of at least one man who was identified, but it was a.
Again, just bringing that in there.
Yeah.
Since it's
Yeah,
been, yeah.
Right.
But it might be really
Yeah.
interesting to look at that, because when you think that during that, if we're looking at a generation of readers, those girls might not have been supported in the home for additional education. So they had to go find role models.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in our other piece, we also talked about, you know, and that was one of the questions was there anybody who discouraged your reading habits? Did anyone in your family discourage reading or give you negative messages about reading and your reading habits? And there were, and they were particularly women. And they were women whose parents or a significant other said, you have enough education, you know, stop doing, you know, you're not gonna need it, you know, and that kind of thing. So there's clearly that piece to it.
Clearly.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, and one person said that
Or
she.
you've got a pretty face.
Or big boobs.
Sorry, inside jokes from earlier.
Yeah, inside.
Yeah,
Those are
right.
not supposed to-
But there was one who broke off an engagement. It might have been 2 engagements. I think it was at least one engagement where she wanted to get another degree, and her fiance said, "No, you have enough degrees." And her mother said, "No, you should do it." And so she did it. And then she lost that relationship, and she had to move to get the other degree. And then she said, "This degree better pay off." And what she meant was,
Yeah.
well, I'm not sure what she meant. She meant career, but part of me thinks it meant that she would find a better mate as well.
Right. Oh,